The crisis in Syria and Iraq, Australia's involvement in the fight against the Islamic State, and possible diplomatic alternatives to resolving the conflict. From Melbourne, you're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. Tonight we're joined by Dr Scott Burchill from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University. Dr Burchill has served as a political officer on the Indochina and European desks of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra. He is the author of the National Interest in International Relations Theory and has co-authored several other books concerning international relations. To begin our discussion, here is a clip of Prime Minister Tony Abbott detailing Australia's involvement in Iraq.
Again, I stress that this is essentially a humanitarian operation. Strictly speaking, this is a mission in support of the government of Iraq.
Cabinet approved strikes by Australian fighter jets on Islamic State targets that same day. Scott, why did the Prime Minister choose to use the word mission instead of war to describe Australia's involvement in the conflict?
There's a couple of explanations. One is, I think, he's doubting in his own mind exactly how long this will go and the extent to which Australia will be involved. If he classified it as a war, then he can be asked, well, why aren't the full resources of the Australian Defence Force being thrown at this? So he's trying to occupy a position somewhat short of war, but obviously serious enough to inform the population that military activity is taking place and Australian lives are at risk in that activity.
What do we know about the Islamic State in terms of what kind of resources they've got, the land they occupy and the people fighting for them?
Well, they've got a lot of land and a lot of resources now because they're occupying oil fields. They've captured banks and towns, major towns in northern Iraq as well as in Syria. So they're very well resourced, much better resourced than their predecessor organisation, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was. And they seem to have plenty of military equipment as well that they've captured from retreating Iraqi armed forces. They seem to be made up of a mixture of Iraqi irregular forces, former members of the Iraqi armed forces who were demobilised by the Americans after 2003, but there's even reports of many foreign fighters leading brigades on the ground, including Chechens. So it's quite a multinational mixture of people in ISIL.
It does seem to be quite a different beast to Al-Qaeda. Do you think the United States and other Western powers like Australia were caught napping, I suppose, on this particular issue? ISIS surely didn't come from a vacuum. What kind of things should have alerted Western states to the existence of or creation of an organisation like this?
Well, clearly they knew about it, but decided that it wasn't a threat until the vast swathes of northern Iraq were then under the control of the organisation, including significant oil fields, significant strategic locations, and some vast wealth that they'd accumulated through basically stealing money from banks and other occupied territories. So once it became a significant geographical space, and once the barrier and border between Syria and Iraq was effectively erased by ISIL, that's when the West decided to take an interest. They knew this was going on. They just decided that it was, in light of the recent experience they had in Iraq themselves, that they were very reluctant to get back involved, and that the hand has been forced, I guess, by the success of ISIL on the ground.
One nation state that's involved in this conflict, but perhaps not directly, that isn't discussed as much is Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us how Saudi Arabia intersects with ISIS and its relationship with the United States as well?
Well, Saudi Arabia sees itself as the leading Sunni nation in the Middle East, in the region. And ISIL is a Sunni militant organisation which was basically established to confront the Shia-led government of Iraq. So initially Saudi Arabia, or at least the leadership of Saudi Arabia, was quite sympathetic to ISIL, and the funding from perhaps not the monarchy itself, but significant members of perhaps the royal family and private donors within Saudi Arabia were responsible for funding ISIL in its early stages, as was Qatar and other countries, until they got to the stage where they're almost monetarily self-sufficient. So Saudi Arabia bears a heavy responsibility for the creation of ISIL and the sponsorship of it. But of course now under US pressure, they have to distance themselves from the organisation because of the publicity and the anti-Western approach that ISIL's taking.
I mean, they seem to have created something that they now can't really control.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia, and also, I mean, they, like you say, they're under pressure to not continue that kind of support. My understanding is they've trying to restrict people now travelling to go and join ISIS and fight from Saudi Arabia. Is it something
this is a pattern they did it with Al Qaeda. Remember, the majority of the leadership of Al Qaeda, including bin Laden, were Saudis. Many people travelled from Saudi Arabia to fight in Afghanistan and then formed the basis of Al Qaeda. So Saudi Arabia have a history of creating organisations which they subsequently lose control of or don't really care exactly what they do. And that's probably the greatest concern of the West. It's not that the Saudis are continuing to fund the organisation directly because they don't need to anymore, but that the leadership of those organisations have gone rogue and therefore are no longer being, following the orders that are coming from leading countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
I mean, the United States has traditionally had what they like to think of as a friendly relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, what do you make of how the United States is responding to this, the reality that ISIS is, at least in part, a creation of Saudi politics?
Well, it's the same as it was in 2001. The Saudis just get a free pass no matter what they've done. The strategic and economic oil relationship with Saudi Arabia is a prime strategic asset for the United States, not so much because of their dependence on Saudi oil, but because they do not want their economic competitors like China and Russia in particular to get contracts. That was why Iraq was so important to the United States, because Saddam had threatened to strike exclusive deals with China and Russia and France after UN sanctions were to come to an end. Well, the Saudi-US relationship ensures that Saudi oil doesn't go to US competitors. So it's all about control rather than access as far as the US is concerned. And therefore the Saudis get this extraordinary free pass to create trouble in Pakistan, to create trouble in Afghanistan, now to create trouble in Syria and Iraq, and the US is almost trying to clean up the damage that's been done.
It is quite hard, I think, to separate out the military and the diplomatic in this setting, but to look at the military strategy that we now have, Australia has joined this war against the Islamic State, and there were articles this week talking about how airstrikes were aborted because ISIS fighters or Islamic State fighters were retreating into civilian areas. What do you think is the likely outcome of a military strategy that involves airstrikes alone?
Well, history has shown that they're unsuccessful. What a lot of people don't realise is that the bombing of Germany during 1945 peaked at the same time that industrial production in Germany peaked. In other words, the record of aerial bombardment has always been overstated, the effectiveness of it in a strike. And no serious strategic analysts believe that ISIL can be defeated by an airstrike alone. They may be frustrated, they may be halted or slowed in their advance, but they've been bombed now for 3 weeks, and they're still advancing towards the Turkish border, almost unhindered by that bombing campaign. So although it's obviously a nuisance and a real frustration, it's not going to be sufficient to defeat them as an organisation, and they haven't retreated from very much territory, as far as I know, as a result of that bombing campaign.
And in relation to the military strategy as well, this obviously has implications for Assad and the civil war in Syria, although it's hard to just describe that as a civil war now, given that there's implications across both borders. The United States did recently let Assad know, is how they described it really, that they were beginning a bombing campaign against the Islamic State. This surely can only be a military advantage for Assad. Do you agree with that?
Oh, this is a tremendous boost to Assad, because they're basically taking care of his most dangerous enemy. ISIL is always a much more effective insurgency force than the Free Syrian Army or even Al-Qaeda. So by focusing on ISIL, Assad is getting a breath of fresh air and the opportunity to concentrate on the less significant, less dangerous members of the anti-Assad coalition. So this is a fantastic boost to him. Also, the fact is the Americans have got problems legally bombing Syria, because the Syrian government is not necessarily going to give them the authority to breach Syrian sovereignty. They couldn't get a Security Council resolution through because of Russian opposition. So any bombing of Syrian territory is of dubious legal qualification as far as the sovereignty of that state goes. So in many ways they're hamstrung by two things: the border that the West still recognises between Iraq and Syria, and the fact that they don't want to recognise the Syrian government, but on the other hand must deal with them.
Okay, we're going to take a short break and we'll be back after to speak about possible diplomatic solutions to the situation in Iraq and Syria.